Hello? Hi, Noam.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Noam. It's Johan here, and Martin and Rini are here too. And well, there's a whole room full of people. Most of whom, well, a lot of them you might recognize. Ian Tattersall is here, sitting next to me here. You haven't met yet, but
Say some friends. Yeah.
okay. So I think we're not quite. Everyone is here yet. Is that correct? So we should. Everybody's here. Okay. So we can start. Well, we had a good meeting, 3 days. We did miss you, though, and we're very happy that we can see you now and talk to you now and listen to your talk. So the idea would be that you will start with your presentation, and then you can take as long as you like. So if
That's
you...
a dangerous comment.
Hang on. As you can hear, Bob is here too, so...
Oh.
But so you can. So we have in total we have 2 hours available with this system, and it will be recorded, by the way. So it will be put online. So don't be too rude to Bob, for instance. So, but you can take anything between an hour and an hour and a half, or if you want to cut it short, that's fine too. And hopefully you'll be available to answer questions afterwards.
Sure.
Is that okay? So you can
That's
start
fine.
whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I'm very sorry not to be able to be with you personally. Disappointment. What I'd like to do is make some remarks about the architecture of language, at least as I understand it, and what that suggests about the origins of this distinctive human possession. Clearly, inquiry into the evolution of some system can proceed only as far as its nature is understood. No less evidently, without serious understanding of the fundamental nature of some system, its manifestations will appear to be chaotic, highly variable, lacking general properties, and accordingly, studies of its evolution cannot be undertaken. Such inquiry must also, of course, be as faithful as possible to whatever is known of the evolutionary history. These truisms hold of the study of the human language faculty, just as for other biological systems. And proposals in the literature can be evaluated in terms of how well they adhere to these elementary strictures. The problem of evolution of language arose at once in the mid-20th century when the first efforts were made to construct accounts of language as a biological object internal to an individual and capturing what we may call the basic property of human language, namely that each language yields a digitally infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions with systematic interpretations at the interfaces with two other internal systems, the sensory motor system for externalization and the conceptual system for inference, interpretation, planning, organization of action, and other elements of what are informally called thought. The general approach to language adopting these guidelines has come to be called the biolinguistic program. Well, in current terminology, a language understood in these terms is called an internal language, I language for short. By virtue of the basic property, each I language is a system of audible signs for thought, quoting the great Indo-Europeanist William Dwight Whitney a century ago, though we now know that externalization need not be restricted to the auditory articulatory modalities. By definition, the theory of an I language is its generative grammar, and the general theory of I languages is universal grammar, UG for short. That's adapting a traditional notion to a new context. UG then is the theory of the genetic component of the faculty of language, the capacity that makes it possible to acquire and use particular I languages. And UG determines the class of generative procedures that satisfy the basic property and the atomic elements that enter into these computations. The atomic elements pose deep mysteries. The minimal meaning-bearing elements of human languages, word-like but not words, these are radically different from anything known in animal communication systems. Their origin is entirely obscure, posing a very serious problem for the evolution of human cognitive capacities, language in particular. There are insights into these topics going back to the pre-Socratics, developed further in classical Greek philosophy, further still by prominent philosophers of the early modern scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and still further in very recent years, though they remain insufficiently explored. And in fact, the problem that they pose, which is quite severe, is insufficiently recognized and understood. Careful examination shows that widely held doctrines about the nature of these elements are untenable. Crucially, the widely held referentialist doctrine that words pick out extramental objects, that appears not to be true at all. There's a great deal to say about these quite important questions, but I'll put them aside, simply noting again that the problems posed for evolution of human cognition and language are severe, far more so than generally acknowledged. The second component of UG, the theory of generative procedures, has been amenable to study, really for the first time since the mid-20th century. By then, the work of Turing, Gödel, Church, and others had established the general theory of computation on firm grounds, making it possible to undertake the study of generative grammar with a fairly clear understanding of what is involved. The generative procedures that constitute I languages must satisfy certain conditions, certain empirical conditions. First, some of these at least are learnable, as we know, since they're learned, and the capacity to acquire and use I languages must have evolved. Turning first to learnability, acquisition of an I language is evidently based on first the genetic constraints of UG, and secondly, language-independent principles. It has been well established that language capacity is radically dissociated from other cognitive capacities. That fact, along with close examination of the properties of languages, leads us to expect that the second factor, language-independent principles, probably consists substantially of organism-independent principles, not other cognitive processes. That pretty well follows from the dissociation and the particular properties of languages. For a computational system like I language, these language-independent principles are likely to include principles of general computational efficiency, which fall under natural law. And the study of learnability must face the fact that what is quickly acquired vastly exceeds evidence available to the child. That is the normal property of growth of a biological system. Well, turning to evolution, we should first be clear about what has evolved. Of course, it is not languages. Languages don't evolve. They change, but they don't evolve. What has evolved is the capacity for language, that is UG. It is unhelpful to suggest that languages have evolved by biological and non-biological evolution, James Herford's term. The latter is not evolution at all. With these provisos in mind, I will continue to use the conventional phrase evolution of language, recognizing that it can be and sometimes is quite misleading. One fact about evolution of language that seems to be quite firm is that there has been none for 50 or 60,000 years or more. There are no known group differences in capacity for language, or in fact cognitive capacities generally, indicating that the system has not evolved. Not surprising in such a short period of time. Another fact to which we can appeal with less confidence is that not long before that, a language may not have existed at all. For now, at least, it's a reasonable surmise that language, more precisely UG, emerged at some point in a very narrow window of evolutionary time, perhaps in the neighborhood of roughly 75,000 years ago, and has not evolved since. In the burgeoning literature on evolution of language, this surmise is sometimes described as anti-Darwinian or as rejecting evolutionary theory. But these criticisms are based on serious misunderstanding of modern biology. Apart from these two facts, one quite firm, the other plausible, the available record tells us very little. And the same seems to be true of complex cognitive capacities generally. That's a very thin basis for studying evolution of language. It does, however, yield one suggestion, namely that what evolved, UG, must be quite simple at its core. And if so, the apparent complexity and variety of languages must derive from changes since the shared changes, not evolution, since the shared capacity evolved, and they're probably localized in peripheral components of the system, which may not have evolved at all. I'll return to this suggestion. We may also anticipate, as I mentioned, that the appearance of complexity and diversity reflects lack of understanding, a very familiar phenomenon, of course. As soon as the first efforts were undertaken to construct generative grammars by mid-20th century, it was very quickly discovered that very little was known about languages. That was contrary to assumptions at the time, as I recall very well from my student days. Even about the languages that were well studied, virtually nothing was known about them, as was quickly discovered. Furthermore, many of the properties revealed by close study posed quite serious puzzles, some of which are still alive today, along with many new ones that continue to be unearthed along the way. At the time, mid-20th century, it seemed to be necessary to attribute great complexity to UG in order simply to capture the empirical phenomena of language, which were being unearthed as soon as generative grammars began to be constructed for a fair variety of languages, as was the case in the 1950s, and also for their apparent variety. It was always understood, however, that this cannot be correct. The reason is that UG must meet the condition of evolvability, and the more complex its assumed character, the greater the burden on some future account of how it might have evolved. And it's a very heavy burden, as the very few available facts about evolution of language indicate, those I mentioned. For these reasons, along with general considerations of rational inquiry, the research into I languages and UG from the very outset sought to reduce the complexity of assumptions about their nature and variety. I won't review the history of steady progress in this direction, familiar to most of you, particularly with the crystallization of the principles and parameters framework in the early 1980s. That, for the first time, offered a way to account for the problem of language acquisition without what seemed to be hopeless barriers, and it opened the way to vast expansion of empirical materials available, studied at a level of depth that was previously unimaginable. By the early 1990s, it seemed to a number of researchers, myself included, that enough had been learned so that it might be reasonable to approach the task of simplifying UG in a somewhat different way, namely to try to formulate a kind of an ideal case and ask how closely language approximates the ideal, then seeking to overcome the many apparent discrepancies, sometimes called approaching UG from below. This effort, adopting this approach, has been called the Minimalist Program. It's in fact a seamless continuation of the study of generative grammar from its origins, adopting a somewhat new approach of the kind I just mentioned. Well, the optimal situation would be that UG reduces to the simplest computational principles which operate in accord with conditions of computational efficiency. This conjecture, the conjecture that this is true of language, is sometimes called the strong minimalist thesis, SMT for short. Some years ago, SMT would have seemed a very exotic idea, but in recent years, evidence has been accumulating suggesting that something like this may not be far from true. So it seems to me at least. That would be a surprising and significant discovery if it can be established. It would also open the way to addressing the study of evolution of language, really for the first time. I'll return to a few words on the prehistory of contemporary study of evolutionary language. After that, I'll return to this matter. Well, as I mentioned, the problem of evolution of UG arose as soon as the biolinguistic program was undertaken, roughly 60 years ago. The problem had, of course, been discussed in much earlier years, at a time when language was regarded as an internal biological object, so that its evolution could at least be formulated as a problem. Evidently, if language is not regarded as a biological object, its evolution cannot be seriously discussed. 19th century Indo-Europeanists often did consider language in internalist terms as a biological property of an individual, but there were barriers, serious ones, to studying its evolution. The minimal conditions that I mentioned at the outset of these remarks were not satisfied. In particular, there was no clear understanding of the nature of the system that had evolved, satisfying the basic property. In 1886, the Paris Linguistic Society, major international linguistic society, famously banned papers on language origin. They adopted the view of the prominent scholar William Dwight Whitney that, quoting him, The greater part of what is said and written about the topic is mere windy talk, words that, in my opinion, still merit attention. Well, there is a kind of a standard story about what happened next. It's summarized accurately by Jean Aitchison in a volume called Approaches to the Evolution of Language, edited by three leading figures, James Herford, Michael Studdert Kennedy, and Chris Knight. Aitchison cites the famous ban on evolution of language and then skips at once to 1990 when she writes, all of this changed with a paper by Steven Pinker and Paul Bloom that demolished some intellectual roadblocks in understanding the relation between evolution and language. That's James Herford's comment. The Pinker-Bloom paper, Aitchison continues, emphasized that language evolved by normal evolutionary mechanisms and commented, quoting them, that there is a wealth of respectable new scientific information relevant to the evolution of language that has never been properly synthesized. The field was then able to take off, became a flourishing discipline, according to this version, with many publications, conferences, and so on. Well, that's pretty much the standard story. But the real history seems to me rather different, and not solely because of the accuracy of Whitney's strictures. What I think seems to me to have happened is pretty much the following. After the late 19th century and the following structuralist period, language was not typically regarded as a biological object. So the question of its evolution could not be raised. It's the reason for the long gap. European structuralism commonly adopted the Saussurean conception of language, in the relevant sense of language, as a social entity, as Saussure himself put it, a storehouse of word images in the brains of a collectivity of individuals founded on a sort of contract. For American structuralism, standard concept was that of Leonard Bloomfield, leading theoretician, for whom language is an array of habits to respond to situations with conventional speech sounds and to respond to these sounds with actions, or in a different formulation of his, language is the totality of utterances made in a speech community. Whatever these presumed entities are, and I think that's pretty obscure, but whatever they are, they're not biological objects. Hence, there is no study of evolution of the systems. Matters changed in the mid-century, mid-20th century, as I mentioned, when the first efforts were made to study eye languages in terms satisfying the basic property. As I mentioned, the problem of evolution of language arose at once, but could not be seriously addressed. The task in early years was to construct a theory of language, theory of UG, rich enough to permit description of the facts that were quickly being unearthed in a variety of languages. But the richer UG, the greater the burden on evolvability, and accordingly, little could be done. There was a very important step forward in 1967 with the publication of Eric Lenneberg's book, Biological Foundations of Language, the book that founded the modern study of biology of language. This work in 1967 did contain quite serious discussion of evolution of the language capacity, which Lenneberg properly distinguished from the non-topic of evolution of language. And it had many important insights, also a fairly sophisticated argument in favor of discontinuity of evolution of the language capacity on biological grounds, which he elaborated. Nevertheless, the basic problem of richness and complexity of UG persisted. In the following years, 1970s, there were a series of international, in the US, domestic scientific conferences bringing together distinguished biologists along with linguists, philosophers, and cognitive scientists. The issue of evolution was, of course, discussed, but with little outcome for the same reasons. I myself was co-teaching a seminar in biology of language at MIT in the 1970s, co-teaching with evolutionary biologist Salvador Luria, Nobel laureate. Several of the students went on to careers in the field. Evolution of language was one of the main topics, but again, with little to say